Hello and welcome to the Climate Crisis Advisory Group's second public meeting of 2022. It's great to have you with us today for what will no doubt be a captivating discussion. Now, this month, our focus is on trust in the international system and the actions we must now take to guarantee climate equity between the nations that have and continue to be disproportionately impacted by the severe effects of the climate emergency. It's not surprising that so many of us have lost faith in our world's nations to deliver on their climate promises and turn their rhetoric into real, tangible action. While a critical path and sense of urgency was set out at COP26 last year, the lack of action and accountability since risks deepening the sense of mistrust in our international system. So, what can we do to restore this confidence and finally start to see justice for those most negatively affected by the climate crisis? Here to tackle this meaty subject are a number of special guests. Joining us today alongside our CCAG scientists, we have Isabella Teixeira, co-chair of the International Resource Panel and former Minister of Environment for Brazil, Rowan Hooper, editor of The New Scientist, Tim Mugawa, founder of Green Campaign Africa, and Katarina Safati, Inclusive Action Climate Director at C40. Thank you all for being here. You are all very welcome. Now, I'd like to first head to Katarina. It's great to have you with us today, and you've got an incredibly interesting role as Inclusive Action Climate Director for C40. We'd really love to hear your thoughts and perspectives on the climate crisis and on trust.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation and for having me here. Yes, in C40 Cities, which is a network of global mayors at the front line of tackling the climate crisis, I've been tasked to develop and head a program called Inclusive Climate Action that basically supports our mayors and cities in ensuring that the concrete climate actions and policies that they're putting in place are also equitable and just, which is very easily said, and as you can imagine, very challenging to be done, but also very exciting to be done across different geographies and different places. Having set up this program from the start and having now worked on it for the past 5 years, the data, the research, the action, and also the political reality that I've seen in cities shows that it's impossible to tackle the climate crisis without tackling inequality, and vice versa. It will be impossible to tackle inequality without tackling the climate crisis. And this very basic truth is seen every day in the concrete practice of cities and citizens every day in the cities we work with. And what do I think this means concretely? First of all, that equity and social justice should be at the forefront of the political debate, not just something that is rightly taken forward by civil society organizations, but really at the front and center of political, local, and national debate. Second, it means that we need to show concrete actions on what it means to put inclusivity and equity at the core of climate decision making. We need concrete actions on energy poverty, on affordable and social housing, on mass transit for everybody, and we need to show it now. In C40, we have a priority for 2022 that we need to focus on immediate action and not anymore targets without accountability. 2030 is not enough anymore, and let alone 2050. Really, to restore trust, we need immediate action immediately that has immediate benefits concretely immediately, because citizens and people are tired of targets that are long-term and that politicians that take them now will not be accountable for them in the next 8-10 years. And then lastly, I would say two last things. One is we need just transition narratives and examples to be held successfully by the climate movement and not being just appropriated by fossil fuel lobbies. Too long, I have seen that just transition narratives and concepts are seen as an excuse to slow down climate action, or lower the ambition. But actually, if we don't ensure that the transition is just, we will lose the battle and we will lose the trust of people that are not already in the climate movement. And so it's really critical that the climate movement owns the just transition narrative and actually is able to tell a story on how just transition is really implemented across cities and across nations. So just transition for faster and ambitious action and not for slowing down action. And then one last thought, and I will close it here. It's very hard as a European to ignore the day that we're in today. I know we have Ukrainian colleagues joining or that should be joining. European has woken up to a taboo, war at home. And we cannot ignore that the energy crisis and the transition is at the core of this potential war, and the consequences of this potential war are at the core of further energy crisis. We need to show much more what global solidarity means. We need to show examples of global solidarity. And I think to regain trust, we also need to be credible in terms of champions of global solidarity. And to be credible, we need to tell the truth. At stake is not just the climate crisis and a climate safe planet. At stake is peace and livelihoods. And I think a word of truth is critical to be credible and therefore to gain trust. Thank you very much for having us and for this discussion.
Thank you, Katarina, for those very pertinent points. Everything we do, all our actions are connected. Yeah, you are so right. Are there any direct questions you would like to put to our panel?
Yes, we thought about 3 of them. So the first, should I do them all 3 of them?
Let's do them one at a time.
Okay, so I guess the first one is building on what I was mentioning now. How do you think it is possible to for the climate movement to own the idea, the concept, the narratives of just transition and avoid appropriation by fossil fuel lobbies? And therefore, what does just transition entail concretely in your perspective?
Very strong question, really important. Who would like to take that one on amongst our panel? Yes, Sir Dave, would you like to start? Sir Dave, can you unmute yourself, please?
I'm happy to attempt to reply, but I guess I'm going to lean on my colleagues to come in. I think the first thing is, and I would like to suggest that Aranava should come in. I think the real question is, can we bring together the developed and the developing world to discuss the demands that we all share with you for a just transition? Right, so I think the question is to what extent CCAG can play this role. I'm going to say that there isn't a word that Katarina said that I would disagree with, and as a CCAG group, I suspect we all agree with your line. Now, the person in the group, and I'm pointing a finger at you, Aranava, who's probably done more on this than any other, is Aranava Ghosh.
Okay, so David has handed on the baton to you, Aranava, and then can we go to Mark afterwards?
Okay, thank you and good day to everyone. I was hoping Mark would come in because usually he carries the heavy burden of whatever I say after him. But this time I've got to play the relay role before him. But jokes aside, this is of course an important issue. But the proposition I would put to everyone here, especially since Sir Dave has asked us, is there a way to bridge the North and the South, developing and the developed? I would argue that when we use the word just transition, we are still very limited in a sectoral silo. So we say, is there a just transition out of coal, out of gas, out of oil, right? But we are not talking about not just what is the end state within that sector, but what is the kind of economy overall that we are trying to build. And that systemic change will only happen when there is an alignment of growth, politics, and climate. In order to do that, the mantra, at least we have been proposing a lot in India through our research across all our areas of work, is what we call a seemingly impossible trinity of jobs, growth, and sustainability. And when we think of any kind of public policy measure, we see that either it tries to solve for jobs and growth in terms of new investments, say in renewables, but does it also tick off the sustainability box? Or we could be looking for, new investments, say in the steel sector, which might bring in jobs and investment, but not be sustainable unless we are following new patterns of production. We could be looking at how food is consumed, and then you look at new patterns of consumption. This trifecta of jobs, growth, and sustainability has to be the filter through which all public policy measures at any international level, at a national level, or at a subnational level has to be evaluated against. Unless we do that, we will not be able to create coalitions of supporters towards that so-called just transition across the sectors, because then we are pitting vested interest in an existing sector against vested interests or emerging interests in that sector. So let me just conclude this intervention by saying, if you took that mantra of jobs, growth, and sustainability, we estimate that in India, we are going to have 1 million jobs in solar and wind alone by 2030. We are already at 111,000 jobs. Now, on top of that, we could get, and in my room is my colleague who's working on sustainable cooling. On top of that, we'll get 2 million sustainable cooling jobs. Across, I can see my colleague who deals with green hydrogen, and we can get 1.9 million jobs in the green hydrogen supply chain. And then we have another team looking at sustainable food systems and rural economy. Now, sectorally, these are all separate. The way governments work, these are all under separate ministries. But when we start pulling all that data together, you see there is a completely new emergent workforce that is going to be, that can trigger a completely new political economy for that transition. So this is not to take away from the need to focus on the welfare of the coal workers who will suddenly become unemployed and how to have a just transition within the sector. But the sustainable move forward has to be through this alignment of politics and growth and climate through that mantra of jobs, growth, and sustainability.
Thank you, Dr. Arunaba. Professor Mark Maslin.
Well, I have to say it's always inspirational to hear Arunaba's comments, and I am looking forward to the revolution that's happening in India. However, I think for me, I think one of the ideas about the just transition is we need to communicate with people that poverty is not a natural state. And I think that for too long, our politicians have said to us, the reason we have poverty is because that's how the economy works. But if you look at different countries, you have different levels of poverty. And even in my own country, which is either the 5th or 6th richest country in the world, we have extreme poverty. We have huge numbers of people going to food banks, even though we have the money. So I think to have a just transition, firstly, we have to deal with that inequality. We have to deal with that political myth that poverty is a natural part of society. We need to actually break that and actually be able to empower the poorest and most vulnerable people in our societies to lift them up in all countries, because then they can participate in the transition. If you're struggling to get enough food for yourself and your children day to day, you cannot worry about sustainability. You cannot worry about the state of the planet. So for me, the just transition is really about that justice. It's about breaking that mythology of poverty. It is about making sure that people are sharing in the bounty of each of the countries that we actually work in and we engage with. And actually then that will allow us to have those bigger discussions about making sure that housing is properly sustainable and of high quality. We have transport that people want to use, but it all comes down to poverty.
Thank you, Mark. I've been thinking about this a lot, and you guys are so right. There is no way we can solve the climate crisis without solving inequality. They both go hand in hand. We have to deal with both of them at the same time. I'm also going to take some answers from Rowan Hooper from the New Scientist. You're going to be asking some questions later, but I can see you've got your hand up on this one, Rowan.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick point so what Katarina was saying about the danger of fossil fuel companies kind of hijacking the process and the transition. What we saw at COP26 was a commitment to phase out subsidies to fossil fuel companies, which is something that, has annoyed many people over many years. So to keep the pressure on that commitment and to ramp that up to make sure we follow through on that, I think that will go some way to, restoring trust and to making fossil fuel companies pay their way in this transition. And the other thing I just wanted to say about after what Mark was saying about poverty is what's been really surprising to me looking into different schemes around the world that have been aimed at alleviating poverty is that it actually doesn't cost very much to do that, surprisingly. If we're talking about getting people off the bottom rung of the extreme poverty ladder, there's been loads of experiments looking at cash handouts and one-off payments of a cash sum, and it turns out that you can sustainably lift poor families off the bottom rung of the ladder with one-off payments. So it wouldn't actually cost much to really, and we're not talking about making everyone prosperous, but getting them at least off the bottom rung of the ladder and start to generate the extra income, and education comes into it as well. So that's the point is it's actually doable, and doable quite inexpensively to tackle poverty on a global scale.
Thank you, Rowan. Thank you for that. Katarina, have you got another question for us?
Thanks. Very, very inspiring comments. I think what Aruba was saying around green jobs is fascinating. But on the other hand, it's also interesting to look at those green jobs and look at the quality of those green jobs, who they're accessed by. Are they actually really accessed by youth, BAME communities, women, or are they accessed by the usual suspects? What is the quality of those jobs? That's also something that would be interesting to investigate more, and some of our cities are doing it, and where you see the problems around just transition and the emerging economy, and not just the sort of potential solutions. But to be quick, my last question was around cities and national governments. We're a city organization. Cities and mayors are taking action and leadership on some of these areas. They're actually showing concretely what global solidarity means and what just transition means in practice. And how could we use the sometimes also conflictual tensions between cities and national government to increase action on climate and to increase it in a way that it's equitable and fair?
Another great question. Thank you, Katarina. Who would like to take this one on the panel? We got, okay, so Dave, I see you've got your hand up there. Let's get you unmuted, Dave.
Yeah, let me just say a few words while others are thinking about their answers. I think this is an extremely important question. What we need to see is that the political leaders actually understand the nature of the challenge that climate change represents today. And what we are saying as a group is that, as a climate crisis advisory group, is that tipping points are already beginning to collapse. And we're looking at the Arctic region and the extreme weather events around the Northern Hemisphere that we have related those two events. And the cost of those extreme weather events, if I can put it crudely, in the region probably of $500 billion around the Northern Hemisphere just last year. So we're looking at this getting worse into the future, because all of it is driven by the tipping points going up in the Arctic Circle region. So I think giving them the important facts and somehow opening the door to getting that communication functional is a critical pathway. And of course, that is what we see as our function, CCAG.
Thank you, Sir Dave. Professor Chi, I see you've got your hand up there as well.
Responding to that great question posed by Katarina about the conflict and cooperation between cities and the national governments, I would like to just bring us attention to this the pilot program, the low carbon pilot program, particularly low carbon cities pilot program in the last decade. And starting in 2010, in China enacted the first batch of the pilot program for 5 provinces and 8 cities. And then the year 2012 and later another round of pilot cities. And overall, in the last decade, there are 84 cities and were chosen as pilot cities. And what happened in these cities? And these cities are encouraged and challenged to propose their own target year for peaking their carbon emissions. And starting later in 2020, now China has a national policy, the national target for not only the carbon peak, but also the carbon neutrality. These pilot cities now are asked to start a race to the top, to who can actually come up with an earlier peak and earlier carbon neutrality. And we can see in this race, these cities are competing against each other, which I think is really interesting, because the mayors, they really want to show they are doing better. They're having better performance. In the past, the competition is about who would have the greater growth of GDP. And now with these pilots, with these new targets, and these cities are actually competing on the carbon neutrality and the carbon peaking. I think this is just one particular mechanism working now here in China. And these 84 cities, they're actually leading in the nation. Another 330 of them are just following around the major cities, and much smaller cities are also doing the same. This is not a market mechanism. This is I think it's a quite particular here in China, because the administrative role they are playing, the role of administrative system and the party system actually is also working on this, for this kind of interaction between the national government and the city's government. And it's actually working gradually in the last decades. It's working pretty well, and a lot of other cities and regions are following this too.
Thank you, Professor Chi. I mean, the race to sustainability, that's a race that I would love to see. And I think it's a very healthy race that we all need. And it's interesting that you talk about sustainable cities, because that's going to be our topic next month. So it's a nice little segue there. I see Mark and Klaus, you've got your hands up, but I'm going to have to move on because Isabella is here and I know her time is limited. So I just have to say a very warm welcome to Isabella. Isabella, thank you very much for being here today. And as someone who's dedicated your life towards helping the environment, would you mind please telling us a bit about where this passion came from and your perspective on trust? And then, of course, feel free to share your questions with our CCAG panel.
Oh, thank you very much. First of all, for inviting me. Nice to see you again, Mercedes. I can see you here, Kay, and all other friends. I do apologize because I don't have much time. I have 3 meetings, overlap meetings today. Stockholm plus 50, this meeting, also human rights and climate risks, etc., etc. I don't know what's happening. I'm waiting for Christmas, I confess. But I'd like, first of all, to not only to thank you, but to say my passion. I'm a Brazilian lady. It's important. It's impossible to be a Brazilian without passion. And I'm a biologist also. And I'm from a generation in Brazil that it was the generation that was born in Brasilia, the capital, at the beginning of the 60s. And it was a special momentum for Brazil because you have the dictatorship and also have the freedom, our democracy back. And I was part of this. So I think that I understand very well the role of nature and the importance of a country like Brazil, not only to biodiversity or for conservation, for nature conservation, but also our expression of soft power as international role and the importance of diplomacy, considering our environmental diplomacy, considering our history of environmental policies in Brazil. My career is a public servant, so I used to work in the last 37 years, and I was part of this construction of this trajectory in Brazil, and so that I still love considering this agenda. It's absolutely important. I was part of different moments like Rio 92, Rio Plus 20, PPG7, all different Paris Agreement, Nagoya Protocol, Minamata Convention, different perspectives, and I'm fully responsible for the problem that we have today. So I have to move, and also as a biologist, I'm a PhD, but in energy sector, and I fully believe that we need to bring science together with policymakers and also to make clear how we can move forward based on the solution, not based on the problem. So it's try to summarize my experience here. And as a Brazilian, I think that the Brazilian woman, we have responsibilities, and we need to understand better our new role, considering the emergence of this new world that's coming. So I think that my first point here, as you mentioned, trust. I think that we need to understand the context that we are moving now. It's not only based on global perspectives, but it's based on planetary perspectives. And this is a new political approach. Trust means that we need to change our way to approach things and to build solutions. It's not only a self-centered concept like global perspectives, but it's a planetary perspectives. We are managing something that we don't know the consequence. And my feeling is that this is, in my perspective is the biggest, most important political challenge that we have. They need to shift our mindset, they need to shift our political understanding, how we come in solutions consider the triple environmental crisis. This is my first point. The second point is that we need to understand, for trust, we need the need of political ambition to change. And my feeling is that we are acting based on the past, not based on the future. And this is very important to observe because you have a slow pace into the international community to manage the solutions and also to break the rules in quote this expression, to make sure that you can go faster or move faster into actions, into solutions. Based on my experience, my feeling is that to have this transition, the new international world is coming, but still you have this powerful driver from the traditional political interests and the economic ones that pushing this agenda back. There is no time to be bought, or no time to buy, it's true, and for scientists, but for the political world, the policymakers, they used to like to postpone things, so to buy time. Okay, it's a contradiction, but it's true. And it's like, I agree with this position, but I need time to change. And I need time to change is around 20 years or 25 years or 30 years. It's something like this that my feeling going to this new international order, like multipolarity, and also no more only North and South international cooperation, but West and Eastern cooperation. This is very important to observe because you have an important perspective of green global South that is coming, and we need to understand how we come as developing world and developer world, how we share these new values that the green era or the green age is suggesting to us. To change or to trust, we need to recognize the mistakes of the past. And this is something very important to observe. We have difficulties not only in developed economies, but also in developing countries. So, and the relationship between developing and developing countries, we have a good example in climate agenda, when you have the disruptive behavior on the Kyoto Protocol and how developing economies took decision to be out of this. This is to us really a rupture, a disruptive process, momentum that is very difficult today to bring people together, to bring developing countries together with developed countries. It's something very important to observe. It's not only $100 billion per year. Behind the scene, behind this, you have non-confidence, no trust, and some dynamics, the political dynamics that's not clear enough to how we can bring people together. A good example to illustrate this, in my opinion, is the role of UNFCC that used to play recently based on targets like 1.5 Celsius degree, and not necessarily to have the focus on solutions that must be put in practice in short-term perspectives. Let's see. I always like to be provocative, try to share some ideas. For example, loss and damage agenda and the poorest countries, around 57 countries, they must be under the UNFCC umbrella with a robust program and agenda now. Okay, this is something that we cannot discuss anymore because and what's happened in Glasgow, it was a good example how it did with failure in the political decisions because we cannot host these vulnerable players and mainly the poorest countries. And my feeling is that you're not able to give concrete answers in situations like this one. Probably the trust will not be back. Okay, this is based on my experience. I'm not discussing here China, Brazil, I'm discussing the poorest ones. And we need to build solutions. And I do believe that UNFCC should have a framework or a platform, something like this, that should host permanently how address these issues and this situation and deliver concrete solutions. Finally, we cannot forget and trust that we have the role of the societies and the diversity of the societies, and to have the lack of diversity and leadership today in the world. This is very important to observe because if you're not part of the process, probably will not trust with the solution that will come, or have difficulty to trust. And we have exactly this transition today because the leadership, climate leadership, you can have some players like developed world coming, but not necessarily this promote trust in developing countries. And we don't have transparency in some key countries that we need to understand what we want. So the clear example is Brazil, is my country, okay, that used to play in the past with an open agenda, key environmental and climate policies with transparency, with commitments, without obligation to be committed, remember this, and with concrete outcomes. What we have today is exactly the opposite, with a contradictory speech, political speech, and where the government use some arguments to say that everything is like a fake green. I used to use the expression to say that everything is perfect. It's not perfect. When you have the peak of the crisis, is based on the rate of deforestation in the Amazon region. It's not only the Amazon region. It's not only this, but these contradictions that you have today in Brazil is a clear example that you don't have transparency. Consider the public sector, the government, and some public policy. And the other way, you have the engagement of the civil society, private sector, financial sector. Everyone's coming, looking forward to be part of these new perspectives on climate and climate in terms of implementation. So it's not only trade-offs; it means contradictions, political contradictions, and the clear example result that you don't have transparency, and it's impossible to have credibility. It's impossible to have trust. In a country that was a leader less than 10 years ago, it was full engaged to have Paris Agreement and also promote public policy to reduce deforestation and cut around 8% of our emissions. And the most important contributions for climate mitigation in the world 10 years ago. So it's impressive how we can have the setbacks and how indeed the world reacts to this. It's not only to put pressure on, but to understand the diversity of situations and understand, for example, the role of agricultural sector, not necessarily linked to deforestation, but to with co-responsibility to deal with the end of deforestation in the country. But this is a political mindset that we need to change, in my opinion, and the science is very important to come into these local realities and to influence society and business leaders, etc., to change. Finally, I cannot forget that trust must go beyond green wishing. This is an expression that have been used because we have greenwashing and fake green, but we have green wishing today. And green wishing means that everyone wants to be part of net zero by 2050, but no one knows what it means. Indeed, quickly, this is something that, okay, I can look to the right direction. I want the bike, I wish the right direction, but not necessarily I know the dimensions of challenge that you have to address concrete solution, be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Climate change, as you know, have two sides. But when you're part of the problem or part of the solutions, we need to understand how greenwashing will play in a positive way, and we need to go beyond image debate and also beyond the voluntary commitments. When you go into these forest declarations, indigenous people declarations, this is a voluntary commitment, important, but we need to understand how it is coming into the reality, into the NDCs, and how indeed the road in this transition transition years, like until 2030, will manage these voluntary commitments to say that this is part of the solution. If not, everyone agrees, as in the past, but not necessarily you are able to manage act to end or to solve the problems that you agree voluntarily to join. So it's not only rights, this is an important point, but also obligations. I think that we need to have this balanced approach when we discuss with country, society, etc., how indeed you are part, you have obligations in this context. My last comment is exactly this. In Brazil, I have important agriculture, etc., but when they have the pressure on beef industry today, and not because we are vegan or because you don't like beef. It's not this. But before discussing if international community will buy beef from Brazil without deforestation, with traceability, I love to use this expression because I look at Mercedes, we need to understand that 75% of the beef production in Brazil, the Brazilians are the consumers. So first of all, the Brazilians that we love barbecue, we should buy, we should have the conscience to be the priority to buy beef without deforestation, because we are committed as a society to go against deforestation in Amazon region. It's around 9% of our population that's full against deforestation in Amazon region, but we need to connect the dots. So we need to make sense and how indeed our behavior, our responsibility as societies, as citizens, is part of the global solution. So local is also global ones. Local players are also global ones. You need to understand this when you go into the international challenges now to put Paris Agreement in practice, but more than this, to redesign our perspectives considering the challenge of the triple environmental crisis, and also to be planetary, not only to be global players. Something like this that I hope I'm fully dedicated to understand this better. You have new concepts like justice, climate justice, climate equity. You have this trend in the past until now that some development country players use equity as the same of CBDR. It's not necessarily this, or it is. You have also the planetary boundaries and global commons that are coming as important issues now in Stockholm Plus 50. We have this diversity of pictures and frames and platforms that, in my opinion, we need to understand how we can use this in the right direction, not to be reactive as in the past, but understanding that there is, that we have cookies, a lot of cookies in this kitchen, and that we cannot forget that they are all connected. So I think that we need to understand how you approach politically the governance today, and how we prepare the new generation, young people, to come into this debate, because the next 10 years, they will be the policymakers that will take decision. This is very important to understand. And also, my last comment is ESG. Take care, okay? This is important for business sector, but I understand that the values, when you go into social issues in ESG, for example, new values that come into with the new generations will probably imply that you have new passive, social passive, that in the past are not understood as passive. So take care with this, because I think that transparency and trust, they come together as accountability. And accountability means that you need transparency in the financial sector, okay? And also we need the legally binding commitments in the financial sector. And you have leakage today that, in my opinion, is a barrier to have trust, or to bring people to trust what we are doing today. So different dots, different perspectives, and the big challenge for the governance of a new climate governance that Paris Agreement imposed to us. Back to you. Sorry to speak too much.
Right. Thank you so much, Isabella. Thank you for your perspectives, your insights, and your advice as well, and also for your time. We really appreciate that. That was excellent. Thank you so much.
Okay, I have 4 minutes. I don't know if you have any questions, but I have 4 minutes because I mentioned that I'll be back. I joined the other meeting in 4 minutes. So I can have 4 minutes. If not, I can join early my meeting.
It's okay. I think we've got plenty more questions to come in, so we can continue the discussion as we go along with the other questions. But thank you so much. Obrigado.
Thank you very much. Obrigada. Bye. Ciao. Ciao, Mercedes. Bye.
So thank you, Isabella, for that. It's time for us to move on to Rowan. Rowan, you spoke a little bit earlier, and we just want to hear a little bit from you on your thoughts, and also what questions you have for our panel.
Yeah. So one thing, actually, just listening to Isabella there, is I kind of want to channel the voices of some of the people I met in Glasgow at COP26, because I'm a journalist. I've been covering climate change for years as a writer and as an editor, but meeting young activists from around the world in Glasgow was a real eye-opener for me. And we're talking about trust, right? And there's no getting away from it. Like, developing countries were promised money, they didn't get it, and they want it. And they just said, everyone I met there was real anger about this. As you know, we heard this coming out of Glasgow. They don't want words, they want money. And how are we going to? This is my question: how do we restore trust? We can do lots of things. Education, go out and work with people. You can put initiatives in place. All those things are great and really vital. But at the end of the day, they want the money that they are owed, and that they are, that they need. That they're in problems now. Their villages are flooding, their crops are failing. They need that money now. They were promised it. They are due it. How do we so this is the question: how do we rebuild trust without just literally giving them the money? Until that money is in place, how are we going to do that? Or is that the only thing we can do at the end of the day?
Brilliant question there. Money, not words. How do we rebuild trust? Who would like to take that one on? I can see Mercedes Bustamante. What would you like to say on this one?
Thank you, Adi. Thank you, Rowan, for the question. I would like to maybe to put together some points that Katarina raised, and also Isabella raised with the question that Rowan is asking now. So I think it's not just money. Money is important, but also we need to innovate in terms of our political system. So if you want to find poverty, we also need to have all voices on board. It's also questions on about governance and democracy and rights. So we are talking about technological innovations, but we need much more political innovation. So new policies, new way to run the political system so that we have more transparency and democracy. These are two words that Isabella used, and I think are also key for the questions that Katarina raised. And also when you think about cities and national governments, so if you have different political systems, some cities are going to have more autonomy than others. In some places, like in Brazil, the federal systems are so strong that the cities don't have such autonomy to run their own targets. So I think it's not just money. Money is important, but we need to assure that the money goes to the right way. So you cannot just put a lot of money in different countries, under different situations, under different government systems, because this is not going to work. So we need to take care about corruption and governance and all these other issues. And my impression is that sometimes when you talk about trust, we forget these issues. So we still have a colonial heritage that we have to deal with. So some of the mistakes of the past that we need to recognize to build maybe a new order or a new political systems that can cope with the global challenge that we have now. So I think it's important to bring all these pieces together. It's much more than money. Money is important, but we need really to think about new political systems to deal with these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bustamante. Thank you for that answer. Professor Mark Maslin, I see you also have your hand up. Can you unmute yourself, please?
I've just unmuted myself. Thank you for reminding me. I was going to just add a few things, which is we understand that actually we do need to move wealth, money, and expertise into other countries to support them. But I also think that we need to actually have a way of actually monitoring and ensuring that actually that is successful. I mean, one of the biggest issues is that money can flow from developed countries into developing countries, but what happens is it doesn't get to the people that really need it. And what happens is it then gets reinvested in London property, you know. And I think we actually have to sit down and say, as a global sort of like community, we have to actually manage these flows of money, okay? Because there are huge amounts of money flowing around, which are basically not getting to the people that they are aimed at. I mean, this is deep frustration that I know that NGOs, companies, and also development agencies in developed countries, they say they put this money in, and then suddenly they're not even sure it's actually feeding the people who are starving. So I think we need to think it sometimes on a much higher level, which is how do we remove corruption? How do we actually prevent this sort of money actually disappearing into bank accounts in major cities like London?
It's a really good point you make there, Mark. And what I'm getting a sense of is that there is a disconnect between what the general public and everyday people think and what's going on in the political world. And there needs to be more of a connection and an alignment, so we're all thinking on the same page for us, in order for us to move forward. So Dave, I see you also have your hand up there. Can you unmute yourself, please, Sir Dave?
One of these days I'll get it. I just wanted to pick up on what Rowan was saying about funds promised and not delivered, which is obviously a really serious issue. There are two aspects to this. One is the cost of managing risks, the so-called adaptation process. But the other side of it is the deep and rapid emissions reduction we're all talking about. And ideally, we would like to see this consistent with an orderly transition away from fossil fuels and an orderly transition away from environmental destruction. Now, the challenge under the phrase orderly transition is that this is an international process. Aranaba has been talking about using the idea of a remaining carbon budget and distributing it fairly amongst nations of the world. And that is, how do we achieve this? How do we decide what is fair, what isn't fair? But let alone how do we decide that? How do we actually deliver that? When every government is operating under the auspices of their own population. Every government is, in other words, trying to operate in a selfish way rather than understanding, given the crisis, we have to all pull together. And there's the real challenge. How do we reconfigure ourselves? And I'm going to pick up on something I learned from Ye Qi, which is in China. They introduced a new part of their constitution, which is called eco-civilization. And eco-civilization is defined as managing human well-being alongside managing the well-being of your ecosystems, and that includes, of course, the climate. Now, that should be a global objective, and we don't have time. There's the trouble. We have a crisis on our hands. We need to move quickly. And I hate to think this, but it could be that the world will simply watch as we walk into disaster. And as the global economy breaks down for various reasons by mid-century, quite possibly, it's only about then that I suspect the sense will be knocked into people's heads and they'll walk together. How do we manage that now instead of having to wait?
Wow. Wow, very strong point there. I mean, I hope you at home who are watching this live stream are getting the sense of urgency, because if the world is to move together, we need to act now, because it takes so long to get the motors and the machinery of our planet to act together. Dr. Klaus Luckner, I see you have your hand up. Sorry, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, I had pushed the button out of visibility. I had to work on it. I would argue all of these things are important, but we have to also make sure that the perfect is not the enemy of the good. We have to move forward and we have to get things done. And if I have one hopeful part, is that at some level, some of the problems can be formulated quite simply. We are dumping carbon into the environment and we have to stop that. And from that perspective, it's very straightforward. The fossil fuel industry will not like that. And we have to hold their feet to the fire. But we also have the advantage that with these new technologies coming up, we are in a different situation in one important aspect. If you talk about afforestation or soil carbon or direct air capture and disposal of carbon dioxide, it is inherently something which can be done in a distributed fashion. So everybody can start, and we can start small. One of the challenges we have is that we are getting into deep trouble with very large scale things where the integration takes us decades. We got to get started. We have to put carbon away. And yes, it is nearly criminal to promise money and then not give it. So help give it to get projects on the ground started. And I see all of these problems with corruption and all of these are horribly important, but they are not just important for climate change. And if we wait until we fix them, we will be too late.
Thank you for that, Dr. Luckner. I mean, the practical and the scientific solutions are there. It's just trying to get this existential argument sorted out and getting our political people moving.
And pointing out, by making things smaller in individual cases, you can start as a city, you can start as a small company, you can start doing it, and you need to gain momentum. And ultimately, it will require government regulations which say you must not dump carbon into the environment.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much for that. Tim, thank you for your question. We're going to go, I'm sorry, Rowan, thank you so much for your question. We're going to move on to Tim next. And if there's time at the end, maybe Rowan, you can come in as well there. But Tim, thank you for waiting. Really love what you're doing to make a difference. What questions have you got for our scientists?
Thank you, Ade. I'm sorry, it's heavy raining here and the electricity has gone, so we are putting on a generator. Sorry for if the video is not so good. Yeah, my name is Tim. I'm a Ugandan, and I work with the Green Climate Campaign in Africa as its founder and the executive director. I have been an activist for over 10 years. I've moved across Africa, uh, having first-hand experience of what climate crisis is like. Like you are aware, Uganda is one of the most vulnerable countries to the climate crisis. Africa, as a continent, contributes less than 4% of the global carbon emissions that we suffer the most. Personally, I'm also frustrated and I'm losing the trust in the developed countries because we cannot discuss trust without accepting the problem. We need to go back to the cause. How did we get here? We didn't just find ourselves here. There's someone who is responsible for the crisis. And the developed countries, the global north, has the first accept its historical responsibility in polluting our planet. They need to accept the role they had in polluting the planet, burning fossil fuels. I think by time students in the global north are taught the history of their countries, how they developed. How did America, how did Europe develop? They developed at the expense of Africa and the Asian countries, because they may think that Africa is poor because the Africans are lazy. Yes, but the resources are being exploited by developed countries. Secondly, the global north needs to stop double standard. When you discuss phasing out fossil fuels, at the same time you are funding new oil projects in Africa. For instance, in Uganda, France is building one of the world's longest oil pipeline from Uganda to Tanzania. At the same time, they're discussing a switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So it's very difficult for us to trust a system that says one thing in the morning and it changes in the evening. So I would suggest that the global north take responsibility for the historical polluting of the planet. This is where to start. We need to understand how we got here. When you go in Congo, Gabon, the forests are being cleared. They are not being cleared by their own people, by corporations from developed countries like Canada. This is the Apple phones you're having, your computers. Where are the raw materials come from? They come from Africa, in Congo. And what do you live there? Empty mines. In Uganda here, there's a place called the Kasese. It expects a lot of flood. But Britain mined the copper 100 years back. And this is the challenge where it comes from. So in the interest of time, I'll stop here and I go to my question. So the question is, what are the real world effects of breaking down in trust? That's my first question. Do I repeat it or to trust?
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Tim. Apologies out there because your the sound wasn't very clear. It was hard to hear you, but I think what I got from your question was what are the real world effects of a breakdown in trust? So I see Aranaba, Dr. Aranaba, you have your hand up there. Would you like to take that one, Aranaba?
Yeah, thank you, Ade, and thank you, Tim, for very clearly laying down the pathology, because between trust and mistrust and distrust is the fact that we don't operate off a clean slate. There is a history, and we talked about this even on the last call. I think Mark was very, very eloquent about that history. Now, what is the real world consequence? One real world consequence is for the planet, that when trust is broken down, actions are suboptimal, which means that our actions don't add up to keep all of us together on a sustainable pathway. The second real world consequence, about which I have a lot of concern and I've written about this, is that if we don't pair climate action with what I call a deal for development, then what we are really proposing is a perverse outcome. That on one hand, we will push for sustainability, for staying within certain temperature targets. And yet, even if we achieved that, we would widen, not just maintain, we would widen the technology divide between the rich and the poor, the North and the South. And this is really at the heart of things that you've said, Tim, whether it is mining Africa or mining South American countries for new minerals that are needed for the clean technologies of the future. And those are necessary, but it only works, the trust only rebuilds if one part of the world does not treat another part of the world only for extractive purposes. And therefore, we have to reimagine trust, not just as a binary that I have trust today and I don't have trust tomorrow and I'll rebuild trust day after. We have to think of trust as a verb, not just as a noun, which means you've got to act, you've got to sacrifice. It's not always going to be a win-win. You have to demonstrate that because of our past wrongs, we will give up something in order that some other country becomes a co-owner, a co-developer, a stakeholder of the new technologies of the future. Only then will we get a political momentum, not just at negotiations, but the 50 other weeks when we are not at a COP, for countries to say, we are all in this together because we are rebuilding trust. We are acting, we are thinking of trust as a verb on which we have to demonstrate through our actions how we are trying to redress the wrongs of the past while renew a different image of the future.
Well said, Dr. Arinalba. I think somewhere within that trust also lies respect. And I think in order for us to respect these other nations, we also need to learn the history as well. So they're all connected. Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh, I see you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, I guess, a perspective from within countries as well in terms of breakdown of trust, because what we've seen from our work and other people's work is that in countries where there is high trust in government and in politicians, there is much more support for ambitious climate policies and things like carbon taxes and regulations and things which will mean that people have to live their lives differently, potentially change their behavior in quite profound ways, maybe pay towards addressing climate change financially. But you don't get public support for those sorts of actions in countries where the public just don't trust politicians, that they think, why would we want to pay for that when we don't know where the money is going to go and we don't have any faith that you're going to be using it in an effective way and so on, and that maybe they don't trust the people around them to be part of that. So I think it's so crucial that we bring people with us, we build trust through a range of activities, engaging the public, including things like more deliberative democracy, so more participatory forms of engagement with the public to enable them to have a say and really feel like they have a stake in where we're going on climate change. So that was just one thing I wanted to add in terms of how we might build trust, because it is so crucial to get buy-in for the policies that we need to enact, as well as the actual behavioural changes that we need everybody to make.
Thank you, Professor Lorraine. Thank you for all those answers. And unfortunately, it's almost time for us to wrap up today. That was extremely fascinating. Great answers and great questions. Tim, really appreciate that. And to Isabella, to Rowan as well, and Katarina, thank you so much. Now, as I said, that's all we have time for today. A big thank you to our special guest. Once again, and as always, to our CCAG scientists for providing their expertise. And a massive thank you to everyone watching at home. If you have any further questions, then do send them to us on any of our CCAG media channels. And please do join us at our next public meeting on Thursday, the 31st of March, where the focus will be on sustainable cities. See you next time.
The situation with climate change is clear. The crisis is not being managed in the way it needs to be managed at the moment. I am Sir Dave King. I have set up a climate crisis advisory group. The group represents the international experts on climate change to be available to the public, to policymakers, and to the media around the world. We need action now. What we as humanity do over the next 5 years will, in my view, determine the future of civilization.